Okay, it's 11 o'clock. Thanks for joining us, folks. My name is Ivo Koya, and I'm with Thundermist Lure Company. I'm also your host of the Thundermist Fishing Tips TV show, and you may have seen us on YouTube as we're partnered up with YouTube, and we have many videos out there giving tips and advice in different fish, saltwater and freshwater. And I want to thank you for joining me here today. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's walleye. And I'm going to share a lot of different tips and techniques with you today. We're going to touch on walleye in the weeds. We have enough time, we're going to talk about walleye on the rocks, some open water walleye. And I want to share different tips and advice with you that at the end of the day will hopefully put you on to more fish. I tell you, out here in the Ottawa area, between Ottawa and Gatineau, you've got some fantastic fishing here for walleye with the Ottawa River and the Rideau. Just a phenomenal opportunity for a lot of good fishing, so we want to key in on a little bit of that. I'm going to show you some different setups and whatnot. One setup I'm going to show you a little later is this setup here for bottom bouncing. So I know you folks do a lot of bottom bouncing here in the Ottawa area, here in Ontario. And this setup here with a sinker, I'm going to explain this three-way swivel because it's a new three-way swivel that doesn't tangle. And these Viper spoons, when they're tipped with bait, they're just dynamite for walleye. But we'll get into that a little later. Right now, what I'd like to do, let's talk a little bit about, just quickly I want to touch on reels. Reels and line. When you're fishing for walleye, all you need is a small reel. This reel here will accommodate 100 yards of 10-pound test line. That's all you need if you're going to be casting all day long. You don't need a big reel, you don't need to get tired. Walleye aren't going to run too far. 100 yards, that's a football field. So that's plenty of line. Now when you're picking out reels, one thing you want to look for is a reel that has instant anti-reverse. Most reels have anti-reverse, but they don't have instant anti-reverse. And what that means is when your reel stops, that handle should stop on a dime. There's no jiggle in that handle. And that means you've got instant anti-reverse. And the advantage of the instant anti-reverse is that when you set the hook, it's instant. When you don't have that instant anti-reverse, if there's a little bit of play in that handle, every time you set the hook, it's shocking your gears. You're going to wear your reel out. So, you spend a lot of money on your reels, so look for that anti-reverse feature. It's very, very important for hook setting and also for the life of your reel. Second thing you want to look for on a reel is a front system for a drag system. The front drag systems are better than the rear drag system. A rear drag system has to work its way through the reel to the spool. Your front drag system, it's direct. And look for a system that has a nice silky, smooth drag to it. You don't want a drag that jerks off your line because what will happen is it'll put extra pressure on your line. You got a better chance of losing your fish. So silky, smooth drag, very, very important. Now when it comes to line, I'm going to talk a little bit about line, and as I go through some of these examples, I'll tell you which line to use under which conditions, because there definitely is a difference on what line you should use and when you should use it. But when you're spooling up with line, you've got monofilament line, which is really cheap line. It's inexpensive, but monofilament has a few disadvantages. It absorbs light, it absorbs sunlight, regular light, and it absorbs water. So what happens after you're using it, it gets weak over time. Even over the course of the summer, 2 or 3 days out, it'll absorb water and become weaker. So your 10-pound line will become 7-pound line, 6-pound line, etc. So that's one of the weaknesses with monofilament. With fluorocarbon line, it's virtually invisible. It doesn't absorb water, and it's a little more abrasion resistant. So fluorocarbon has some advantages to it. Now a lot of people like to run braided line. I'm just going to talk just quickly about braided line. First of all, when you spool up braided line, you don't want to spool it on directly to your spool. You want to put something on your spool first. Most people put on a little bit of monofilament line first, a few yards, and then put your braided line on, because otherwise your braided line will slip. When you go to set the hook, it'll just slip. It's as if your drag is set on its loosest setting. So you always want to put a backing on your reel before you spool up with braided line. And we'll talk about braid. Okay, I've touched a little bit on lines and reels. I'm going to also talk about rods. This rod has what's called a medium action. You can see the bend there is basically from the middle of the rod to the tip. And when you're working jigs, for example, for walleye, you're going to want at least something with a medium tip or a fast tip. A fast tip rod just means it bends basically from here down. Medium tip bends from here down. A slow tip bends from here down. And there's a time when you should use a slow tip and a time when you should use a fast tip. And right now I'm going to talk about working the weeds for walleye with jigs. And when you're jigging for walleye, you definitely want something with at least a fast tip or a medium tip, because what that's going to do, it's going to give you some hook setting power, and that's what you're going to want when you're fishing the weeds. Now, when I'm in the weeds for walleye, my absolute favorite bait to use in the weeds is a bucktail jig. If I had one bait to take with me on the water, it would be a bucktail jig. And these bucktails you see here, this is a nice fancy one. I get mine custom made by a good friend of mine who's the owner of Big John Sport Fishing. And if you ever want custom made jigs, I'll tell you, he's the guy to go to. He does a great job. And this particular jig is 3 ounces in weight, 3/8 ounce in weight. And what you want to do with these jigs when you're fishing the weeds, first thing you want to do is, well, there's 3 different types of conditions. You're going to want to fish a weed edge, or a weed flat, or a heavy weed flat. I'm going to talk about all 3. On a weed edge, you're going to want to fish the weed edges during the morning, during the evening, or if the wind picks up a bit. If you've got some wind and it's 12 o'clock noon and bright sunny day, those walleye will be on the weed edges roaming looking for food. If the wind dies down and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and the sun is up high, they're going to bury themselves in the weeds. But the weed edges, first thing in the morning or in the evening, absolute dynamite time. And again, if you've got some wind, those walleye will come to the weed edge. Another good time, if it's raining, they'll be on the edges all day long. You could fish weed edges all day long, you'll catch all kinds of walleye in the rain. Now, the key to fishing the weeds with a bucktail jig, you're going to want to make short little casts. I even make a little underhand cast, just a little underhand cast. You want to cast no further from me to the end of the row there, here in the stadium. Because if you cast it out too far and you're trying to fish the weeds, when you bring it back, you're just going to have a jig full of weeds, because it's coming through the weeds this way. If you do a nice little short cast, you're fishing more vertical, and you have a better chance of pulling that, in this case, pulling that bucktail jig through the weeds. And sometimes you will get weeds on it. I mean, you're fishing the weeds, so you're going to hook up with weeds periodically. But I'll tell you right now, short casts, that's the key. I've seen people casting all the time and getting frustrated. You don't need to do that. A nice little short cast as you're working the weed edge, work it back towards you, you'll catch plenty of fish. Now, to work the weeds, ideally you're going to want to have an electric motor. You want to put your electric motor down, and if you have a fish finder in the front of your boat, that's again ideal to have. You're not finding fish, what you're doing is you're finding the weed edge. And that's all you want to do, is follow that weed edge. Typical weeds, they'll start up in shallower waters. You might have weeds up 8 feet, 10 feet deep. Then as you come to deeper water, it starts to decline, and then eventually it'll sparse out to nothing as you get into the deeper stuff. And that's where you want to be, is right in that sparse weed cover. As a matter of fact, when you're fishing the weed edges, if you're off too far into the deep water, you won't catch the fish, because they're going to be hugging in those weeds and in that sparse cover. So the electric motor and the fish finder will allow you to follow that weed edge and make your way to the walleye, and that's key. So short casts with the bucktail, and then you can work it 2 ways. First of all, people ask me a lot, do I have to bait my bucktail? Absolutely not. The walleye will hit this, they'll eat it like candy. They see it like a mayfly hatch, a little bug coming out of the water, and they just instinctively hit it. So you don't need to put any bait to this at all, and when they come through the water, they stream, and then as they fall, they puff out a bit. And that's a great attractor for walleye. And what you want to do, when you toss these out, you've got a couple ways you could bring them back. You could finesse the fish by just lifting it up and then let it fall down on a slack line, slowly. So you lift it up about 2 feet and let it fall straight down. You want it to fall straight down because the walleye is going to think it's something that's injured and is falling down. If your line is a bit tight, you're going to jig it up, and if it starts, you're pulling it back that way, it might think that it's something that's swimming away, a bit of a harder meal. So let it fall straight down. So just jig it up, straight down. Let it hit the bottom. Jig it up again, let it fall straight down on a slack line. The walleye will always hit that jig on the way down. They'll hit it on the way down 9 times out of 10. When it hits the bottom, they won't pick it up anymore. You've got to jig it again. So once it hits bottom, give it another jig. The other thing you're going to want to do when you're fishing the weed edges for walleye, you're going to want to watch your line. I just said when you lift it up, you let it fall on a slack line. Keep your eye on your line where it goes into the water. What'll happen is when the walleye hit that bucktail, it's such a subtle hit, you'll see your line, it'll just make a little twitch. You just see your line twitch just ever so slightly. And when you see that twitch, don't even hesitate, just set the hook right away, because that's a walleye who's just taking your bait. So line watching is very, very important when it comes to fishing the weeds for walleye. Now as far as line, what kind of line do we want to use when we're fishing the weeds? You're going to want to use a braided line, and I have braided line here, but I have some fluorocarbon line as a leader. Now the reason we want to use braided line is because we're fishing very close, we don't have a lot of line out, and you want a direct hook set. You don't want any stretch in that line between you and the walleye. When he hits, you want to instantly set the hook. So braided line gets the nod for jigging all the time. But you don't want to tie braid right to your jig or to your lure, because the walleye will see that. They'll see your braided line. I'll tell you, if the walleye are real active and aggressive and you know they're in a school and they're out fighting each other for bait, sure, they'll hit your lure. But 9 times out of 10, they'll see your line, that fluorocarbon line or the braided line, and they just won't hit. So what you want to do is just tie a leader line of fluorocarbon on, and a good knot to use is a uni knot. Use a uni knot, tie your fluorocarbon to your braid. You'll up your catch ratio 10 times, I guarantee it. Braided line is great, but not direct to your lure. You could also use twister tails and shad type baits as well for walleye, but again, the bucktail jig is by far, it's one of probably the oldest lures around, the bucktail, and it catches all kinds of fish. Okay. Actually, before we go off, let's talk a little bit about if you're going to fish the weed edges, you're going to have your electric motor. But let's say you don't have an electric motor and you still want to fish for walleye and you want to fish the weeds. Well, you have the opportunity. If there's a weed flat, which isn't really heavy, like matted, but if it's somewhat sparse, you could drift over top of a weed flat, and again, using a bucktail jig, you could fish right down there in the weeds. And don't be afraid, because these bucktail jigs, short casts, the key there is you're going to want to use a heavy bucktail. This is 3/8 ounce. You're going to want to go to a 1/2 ounce bucktail or a 1 ounce bucktail. I'll share a little story with you. I was fishing a walleye tournament with a good friend of mine, Big John, the guy who makes these jigs actually. And this is back in the day, and we were jigging away and working a weed flat. We caught one fish all day. And we had some other friends that were fishing not far from us, and they caught all kinds of fish. The difference was the weight of the bucktail jig. We were using 1/4 ounce and 3 ounce jigs over top of those weeds. The walleye are down below. Our jigs were not penetrating down through the weeds. So if you're going to fish a weed flat, use a heavier weed jig or a bucktail jig. Get it right down there. Don't be afraid. And when you're jigging it up, if you feel a weed, just give it a little snap, and it'll come right out of the weeds and it'll plop back down again. Speaking of snap, another method is to rip jig. You'll see some people using rip jigging, and that's another technique that you could use, is you toss it out there. Rather than finesse and let it bounce back down, you take your line, take up the slack, and just rip it back as hard as you can, let it come through the weeds fast, and let it fall again. And again, that'll catch the walleye's attention, and they'll just instinctively go after that bucktail jig and hit it. So rip jigging, you might get a little tired by the end of the day, but it's also an effective way to catch walleye. Now when you're drifting, one of the key components to drifting the weed flats for walleye, is you've got to have a drift sock. I'll tell you why. Because you're going to toss this bucktail jig out, you're going to go 5, 10, 15 feet out in front of you, just nice little toss out there. But if you're moving along real quickly, you don't have enough time to jig that bait back. So you throw a drift sock out behind the boat, that's going to slow you down. That's going to allow you to work your jig very, very nicely through that weed bed. And you'll up your catch ratio with a drift sock. The other thing, when you put the sock out, when you're jigging over a weed flat, you always want to fish where you're going in this case. You don't want to fish where you've been. So you put the sock out, it's drifting behind you, you're tossing the line out in front of you, working the jig to where you're going. If you toss it behind the boat, the wind is going to move you, and your line's going to be constantly getting tighter, and all you're going to do is snag up with the weeds. So you always want to fish where you're going, not where you've been. The other time, if the weeds are really matted, very, very heavy, thick cover, you can still fish for walleye. What they'll do is they'll bury themselves in the weeds. You'll find pockets of weeds. If you've got a pair of polarized glasses, you'll look and you'll see pockets of open water. And what you do there is just toss your jig into that little pocket and just let it go to the bottom, jiggle it, jiggle it, jiggle it, take it out. Go to the next one, toss it. It's almost like bass fishing where you're pitching your lure. And you could do that all day long in these pockets, and you'll be surprised how many walleye you'll catch doing that, because they'll sit by an open pocket because it's kind of like a weed edge, and that's where they aggressively ambush their bait. The other thing when you're fishing in the weeds, or actually out in the rocks or wherever you may be, you definitely want to have one of these. Fish marker. Catch a walleye, instinctively take one of these, throw it over the edge of the boat right away. Where there's one walleye, folks, there's always more. This marker here will put you on the spot, and I've tried before. There's that house and that tree, forget it. Throw a marker out. It's the best way to go. You'll know exactly where you've been. With your electric motor, once you've done that, is work that whole area around that marker buoy, and you'll instinctively catch more fish. I'll share a little story with you. Fishing up in the Kawartha Lakes. It was high noon. I went to the weeds, went with my family, went out there, caught a nice 5-pound walleye, threw the marker in right away. My wife and kids said it's too hot, so I had to I left the marker in, dropped them off at the cottage, went back, put my electric motor down, worked that area, picked up my limit, and went back to the cottage, and we had a nice dinner. So markers are key. Whether you're open water or weed water, use a marker. If you're in open water and you're trolling with downriggers and that sort of thing, most people just use their fish finder or a GPS and mark the spot on their GPS. But when you're fishing the weeds, you're typically using your electric motor and you're working around. So a visual marker like that is great. And if you're a tournament fisherman, you'll see the tournament anglers, there's some fish markers that are shaped like a seagull or whatever, because they don't want anyone to see where they're fishing. But that one will do just fine. Okay, a little bit about crankbaits for walleye. Now, when you're crankbaiting, let's talk about, first of all, the rod. You can see this rod. That's what I call a slow action rod. See the bend that starts right from my hand and it goes right to the tip. And that's what you want when you're working crankbaits for walleye or any other fish for that matter, because you want to be able to give a little bit of time before you set the hook. So a fast tip rod is going to give you more of an instant hook set, and that's not what you want this time. You want that when you're fishing the weeds with bucktail jigs or jigs, but not when you're using crankbaits. And again, I don't care if you're bass fishing, walleye fishing, whatever it may be, you want a nice slow tipped rod. The next thing you want to use, we talked about braided line using jigs. You don't want to use braided line when you're running a crankbait. I'll share another story with you. Bass fishing last year, I did a little test. Running braided line with a fluorocarbon leader or running monofilament line with a fluorocarbon leader. Out of 10 fish, I landed 1 with the braid. Out of 10 fish with the monofilament, I landed 9. So the difference is, the problem is when they hit a crankbait, you need to have a little bit of time before you set the hook. So our natural reaction is to set the hook right away, which is great if you have monofilament line and a rod that gives a little. The monofilament's going to stretch, your rod's going to give, and that gives you just the perfect amount of time to set the hook on your crankbait. So anytime you're running crankbaits, folks, keep that in mind. You'll up your catch ratio again tenfold. And you're going to want to use crankbaits. It's more of an aggressive lure. So again, cloudy, rainy days, fish are always aggressive, no problem to use a crankbait. If you have a sunny, bright sunny day and no wind, I'd probably put the crankbait away. But if the wind picks up, the fish become more active, again, use your crankbait, no problem. Keep this in mind too, when you're running crankbaits and you're casting all day long, your bait hits the water, it's going to dive down, it's going to come back up again. So it's only a very short period of time that you're actually in the strike zone for most walleye, because they're typically on the bottom when you're cranking. So you want to keep that in mind. So what you're going to want to do when you're bringing in a crankbait, you want to keep your rod tip pointed right down like that, right down to the water. Because what that's going to do is that's going to allow your lure to maximize the depth. It's going to get it down quicker, and it's going to keep it down more in the strike zone. So don't reel with your line up here or with your rod up here. You want your rod pointing right down, almost touching the water. That's perfect for crankbaiting right there. If you're trolling with a crankbait, again, in this case, it's going to stay in the strike zone longer. If it dives 20 feet, it's going to stay at 20. As you're trolling along, it's going to stay there. But when you're casting, you don't have that luxury. It's down and up and down and up all the time. Now, if you're trolling for walleye, you got a lot of line out behind the boat. Now you could switch back to a braided line again. Because with a lot of line out there, if you have the monofilament out and you've got 100 feet of line out there, when you go to set the hook, the first part of your hook set is just going to be all stretch. So in a case like that, like if you're running, especially if you're running downriggers and that sort of, you could use braided line. It's actually an advantage to do so under those conditions. But crankbaiting is a lot of fun, and it will catch you. It'll catch you plenty of fish. And again, you're targeting the more aggressive walleye, aggressive fish. Okay. This setup here I talked about a little earlier. For those of you who like the bottom bounce, this is an ideal setup. First of all, this is a new T-turn 3-way swivel, and the beauty of this swivel is it allows you to fish tangle free. It's the first swivel of its kind that doesn't tangle. In fact, I could show you here, give you a little demonstration. If I take this swivel and hold it, and if I wrap that sinker all the way around, I just want to show you, oh, not around the rod, that doesn't work. Let's try wrapping it around the line. If I wrap that all the way around the line, and I could do this 1,000 times, it doesn't matter. It could get that all twisted up and wrapped up, but what happens is it just comes out on its own, and it always comes back to its natural position. So you can see there that all of a sudden I'm fishing tangle free. So if you're bottom bouncing for walleye, that's very important because you want to make sure that your bait's running, your lure's running, and if you're all tangled up out there, you're not maximizing the action of your lure and your bait. So those T-turn swivels are the key to bottom bouncing for sure. Now if you're going over top of rocks, this particular sinker is a great sinker because it's snag free. It's designed to walk over top of rocks. If you're fishing a mud flat for walleye or over smaller pebbles or not a real structure area, a regular bell sinker is fine. And what you may want to do also is you could run a lighter line to your sinker if you're running a regular bell sinker, because if you do get snagged up, you'll want to lose your lure, not necessarily the rest of your rig. So basically, that sinker is going to touch bottom, and then we go about 2.5 feet to a viper spoon. And if you haven't seen these viper spoons in general, folks, walleye love spoons. You've read many articles about spoon-fed walleye. And walleye is probably, when it comes to spoons are probably the best bait you could use for walleye. They love spoons. It's a bait imitator. That's what they're eating all day long. They're eating, panfish and bait fish. And a spoon is a perfect bait to use. And this particular spoon is actually designed to accommodate bait. So the viper spoon will take, and different size viper spoons will take different size baits. So, for example, this particular size will take a night crawler very, very nicely. And if you put a night crawler on the back, that's a bread and butter bait for walleye. So you would drift this or troll this along the bottom. This will be about 2 feet off the bottom. Perfect strike zone for walleye all the time. And the other advantage with this kind of a setup is you could fish different depths. If you're in 20 feet, then you come up to 15 and you go back down to 20. With a setup like this, that sinker is going to continuously follow the bottom. And when I talked about the strike zone with the crankbaits, this viper spoon will always be in the strike zone because it's always following the contour of the depth. So you're always going to be 2 feet off the bottom. So again, you're maximizing the amount of time on the water for catching walleye. And as I said, these come in 5 sizes and 5 colors. The smallest size is the size 1. And this particular size comes with 2 hooks as compared to 3 hooks. And this size here will accommodate, for example, a minnow or a leech. I'll tell you, not that I'm a spokesperson for Berkeley or anything, but I was using the Berkeley gulp leeches with this size here for walleye, and they're just eating it up like there's no tomorrow. Absolutely love it. The beauty of the Viper spoon when it comes to walleye is that it's a perfect combination of flash, flutter, and bait. And if you're using real bait or scented bait, as your spoon's coming along in the water, you're actually creating a scent trail. So the fish, they just hone in on that and they strike. Now when you're fishing a setup like this, because it's a universal setup, you're bound to catch some other fish as well. For example, pike might be out there. Pike will take this really, really easily, as will a muskie. But they're all snelled with titanium wire line, single strand titanium, so you're protected against toothy fish. And this, to me, folks, it's a walleye magnet, this setup right here. For bottom bouncing, it's the best way to go. Okay, we're covering a lot of topics here. We're sharing different tips and techniques, but there's one more I want to share with you before we wrap up, and that's jigging for walleyes. I want to share some techniques when it comes to vertically jigging for walleye. Now, when you want to jig for walleye, this is actually a new jigging spoon. It's called the Boa Jigger, and you can see it's got a 2-hook design here. I'll just explain this briefly. It's designed also to accommodate bait. So what you would do with this, you could put a worm on there, or a minnow, if you'd like, or any type of bait. If you want to put a leech on there as well. And they've got a built-in clacking system here. There's 3 beads, plastic and brass, that make a clacking sound that acts as an attractor. The 2 hooks accommodate your bait very, very nicely. The second hook acts as a built-in stinger hook, and it's also a special hook. It's called a bent limerick hook. And this bent limerick hook is specially designed to give you the edge for hook setting. So it's a dynamite combination, and what you do there, if you're ice fishing, you could use a smaller size, like a 1/2 ounce size with a minnow. Through the ice is dynamite for walleye. And if you're fishing in open water, what you're going to want to do, again, let's talk about line for just a second. Braided line is the way to go when you're vertically jigging, because again, you want a direct hook set. You don't want any stretch in your line. So I would go with a braided line, and I would put a fluorocarbon leader, at least about 6 to 8 feet of leader line at the end of your fluorocarbon, or at the end of your braided line. And when you're running fluorocarbon line, there's 2 kinds of line. One is a line and one is actual fluorocarbon leader. And there is a difference. Fluorocarbon leader is a thicker line. It's made more, it's more abrasion resistant. It's more for taking abuse of the rocks and that. Whereas fluorocarbon line is more like monofilament. However, it has the advantages of fluorocarbon. So you could use either a fluorocarbon leader or a fluorocarbon line when you're jigging. Either way is okay. When you're vertically jigging for walleye, what you're going to want to do, and the beauty of this is you could fish different depths with when you're vertically jigging. As you're changing depths, it's still, all you have to do is I would constantly be checking to the bottom to make sure you're close to the bottom. Drop your jig right down, let it hit the bottom, take it up about a foot off the bottom, lift it up, and then again, let it fall down on a slack line. You want it to fall on a slack line because that's going to maximize the action of your jigging spoon. And I don't care what kind of jigging spoon you're using. This is the Boa Jigger, but any jigging spoon, you want to maximize its action. So 2 things. You're going to want to use a snap, because a snap will allow that spoon to flutter its way down and maximize the action. And secondly, you want it to fall on a slack line. With a little bit of tension on that jigging spoon, you're going to take away from the action. And if you have some tension on there, again, you'll catch less fish. No tension, let it fall down. When it gets to the bottom, a lot of folks make the mistake, as soon as it gets to the bottom, they jig it right back up again. If you pause, jig and pause, with the case of a jigging spoon, if you wait 1-2 seconds before you jig again, sometimes 3 seconds, you'll catch more fish. Especially those fish that are a little more reluctant to hit. What'll happen is they'll see your jigging spoon, they'll see it come, they'll see it fall, you got their attention, then you jig it again, and sometimes they might just spin away, they get spooked. But when they see it fall, and if you pause, and they see that pause, and especially if you have some bait on there, they're going to look at that, they see the pause, they get tempted, they hit. And plus, when you've stopped jigging, your jigging spoon, although you haven't really jigged it, as it stopped, it's still kind of slowly settling and fluttering. And it's that little bit of flutter action that just triggers those reluctant fish into hitting. So you're always going to want to wait 2 to 3 seconds when you're working a jigging spoon, and you'll definitely catch more walleye without a doubt. And the other thing you're going to want to do when you're drifting along is you're going to want to make sure you're always on the bottom. So I like to have a fish finder on the front of the boat. As I'm jigging, I keep an eye on the depth, and as I see I'm changing depths, I just either open my bail up, let a little more line down, feel the bottom, bring it up again, and start jigging again. And that way, because if those fish are close to bottom, you want to be a foot within the bottom. And if you've all of a sudden gone to deeper water and you're still fishing, you're fishing suspended now. And again, not that a walleye won't come up and take it, but you might be out of their strike zone. You want to keep it down. So very, very important to stay down close to the bottom. And again, when you're vertically jigging, the key to a jigging spoon is exactly that. You want to be vertical. You want to fish as vertical as possible. If you're fishing with your jigging spoon and you notice your spoon's out there, your line's on an angle, you need to do a couple of things. You need to either put a heavier jigging spoon on, that'll get you down more vertical, or throw a drift sock out in the back of the boat. Again, the drift sock's going to slow you down, and that's going to allow you to stay more vertical, and you're going to catch a lot more fish. Share another little story for you. There's a bass tournament going on. I wasn't in the tournament, but a friend of mine was. And literally we were fishing side by side. And I was catching all kinds of bass at the time, and he wasn't catching any. I asked him, I said, "Are you using jigging spoons?" "Yeah, I've got a jigging spoon on." "How heavy is it?" "It's a 1/4 ounce." Not going to cut it. So I threw him a 2-ounce jigging spoon of mine, and he started catching fish. So those little things make a big, big difference between, you come home, you say the fish weren't biting today. Well, they probably were. So it's the old Einstein, the definition of insanity. Doing the same things over and over, but expecting different results. If you're fishing for a half an hour and you're not catching fish, you got to do something different. New spot, new lure, heavier, see what you're fishing, check out your rig, but do something different, because chances are there's fish around, and chances are you can get them to bite. And when it comes to walleye, folks, again, you have probably one of the best areas here in the Ottawa, Ontario area. I'm from Niagara Falls, Ontario, but you've got a great fishery up here. Lots of fishing opportunity between the rivers and the close by lakes, and even in Quebec here. Great opportunity to get out. And for walleye, there's all kinds of walleye in this area. And there's no reason why you can't go out there and have some fun on the water and get into some fish. Well, I think I covered a lot of areas I want to mention to you. I want to thank you for joining me here today. If you'd enjoyed today's tips, we share all these tips on our Thundermist Fishing Tips website. You can go to thundermistfishingtips.com. We've got videos on there, walleye videos, freshwater, saltwater videos, all kinds of different advice that we share with people. And you're welcome to go there and enjoy the site and participate. It's a great site. And I want to thank you for sitting in here today. And if you want to stick around after, I could show you some of this products and whatnot and talk to you a bit. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So thanks very much. As I always say in my video, good luck and good fishing. Thank you.